This is a production of Cornell University.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. So as Matt noted, today I'm going to share a bit of my research from my program that spans a few different cropping systems as well as spatial scales. So we're going to talk about agroecological practice use throughout the United States. So it's well established that agriculture is a major driver of global environmental change. It contributes to climate change, biodiversity loss, soil degradation, water pollution. And really, there's been a lot of stakeholders, different actors throughout the food system that have been issuing kind of increasingly urgent calls for transformative change. So not just simply small improvements to the sustainability of our agricultural systems, but something a little broader, a little more radical. So here you can see some different titles from some recent peer-reviewed scientific articles calling for this transformative change, both in agriculture and in agri-food systems. We can see similar calls among social movements. So here's the Campesina. This is a transnational agrarian movement of peasant or smallholder farmers calling for transformative change. And then we can look to some intergovernmental bodies that spend a lot of time talking about policy at both national and global scales. So Sustainable Development Goals, or IPBES, making biodiversity targets. So there's a lot of different actors here, different stakeholders, but we see a common thread in terms of this focus on transformation. But there's not a lot of agreement on how we might get there. So one way to think about this, though, is this framework here that I've adapted. So we have 5 different levels, moving from kind of a more incremental changes or improvements in agriculture all the way up to transformational changes in the food system. So I'll walk you through this briefly. At level 1, we see this is really focused on on-farm management practices. So increasing efficiency of input use. So things like drip irrigation or split fertilizer applications. Level 2, we're substituting synthetic or otherwise perhaps unsustainable practices with something that's perhaps more ecological. So compost use or botanical pesticides are just a few examples. So these again are just these incremental improvements to agriculture. And then kind of right at that threshold, moving towards more transformative change, we have this idea of redesigning agroecosystems. And so this is a bit of a simplification, but we can think of this largely as enhancing or increasing non-crop diversity as well as crop diversity to really reshape these farm operations, these farm systems. This is a bit outside of my talk today, but I'll note that the last 2 levels, really we're talking about transforming the food system as opposed to this agriculture. So reconnecting consumers and producers, developing alternative food networks, or creating a new global food system based on important principles that are often left out, like justice and equity. And so this is obviously going to involve a lot of different actors. It's multi-scalar. We're talking about things like policy, economic levers, democratic processes, or different types of social mobilization to actually realize these types of large-scale changes. What I want to mention, though, is that a lot of the research so far really focuses on these first 2 levels. A recent study showed that when they assessed a lot of the public funding in the US, 90 to 95% of that work was focusing on improving efficiency or substituting synthetic practices for perhaps organic or other ecological ones. And so when we're thinking about this in terms of redesign and transformation, perhaps this is a bit of a challenge here that we need to overcome. One way to think about this is through the lens of agroecology, which can be broadly understood as kind of a holistic integration of different disciplines, so social and natural science disciplines, as well as indigenous ecological knowledge, a suite of farming practices, which we'll spend a lot of time talking about today, as well as a social movement, which is really what makes agroecology unique and different than, say, ecological intensification or some of these other types of paradigms we may think about in terms of these ecological practices. And I'll spend just a brief amount of time near the end trying to bring the social movement component into this talk because it's really about the confluence. It's how these things come together. that's key. All right, so when we think about agroecological practices, there's a lot of different ways to organize them. One is through the application of their use. So we can think about these practices from a within field use to a landscape level. And certainly they've been promoted for a wide variety of reasons, but one way to think about them is due to the ecosystem services or the benefits they provide humans. And that gives you a good sense of why we see a lot of research suggesting that farmers increasingly use these practices. So one service might be weed suppression. So this could be through interspecific competition, weed crop competition, or allelopathy with things like cover cropping or intercropping. Soil health, this could be direct applications or amendments of organic matter, for instance, through compost or turning under a cover crop to improve soil health. This could be reducing physical disturbance with reduced tillage or protecting the soil from erosion. Pollination, of course, providing different nectar and other resources for these pollinators. We can also think about this, such as nectar and pollen. We should think about border planting, so hedgerows is also providing habitat for perhaps ground nesting, or the native pollinators are key here. And then biodiversity really engages all 8 of these practices, both in terms of above ground biodiversity as well as below ground. So this is through the provision of kind of these more rich, diverse habitats, both spatially across our agricultural landscapes and temporally throughout a growing season. And I should say, these 8 practices are obviously not an exhaustive list of agricultural practices, but they're the 8 that I'm going to focus on today. So in terms of my research, as was mentioned, it's covered a few different scales here, and the scope is somewhat broad. And so first, I'm going to take you, I'm going to basically discuss my work on forage systems focused in the Northeast. So we're going to spend a little bit of time with winter cereal forages and these dairy double cropping systems and the trade-offs between yield and nutritive value. Staying in the Northeast, we're going to shift to grain systems, and I'll tell you a little bit about my work with cover crop-based, no-till planted soybean production. And the focus here will really be on a multi-tactic approach to weed suppression. And then we're going to scale up to the national scope and focus now on fruit and vegetable systems. And in particular, we're going to look at the relationship between farm size as a proxy for a wide range of characteristics, which I'll explain, and how those might influence practice use, and then spend a little bit of time on motivations and deterrents, and then differentiate between individual as well as structural components there. And I also want to draw your attention to the difference or the scope of kind of the different methodologies or disciplines I used here. So some of these are more exclusively natural science based, and then in some of my latter work, really try to bring in social sciences and then reintegrate it all and take a mixed methods or interdisciplinary approach. And just to give you kind of some higher level takeaways right up front before we get into each of those individual sectors, for the forage systems, really this is about increasing crop diversity. So with these double cropping systems, farmers are now getting 2 crops within a single annual cropping season. But what's also important is they're reducing reliance on these feed imports, often from the Midwest or out of state. And that's going to really help localize or recouple those nutrient cycles. And so this is where we're not really just interested in, increases in efficiency or some form of substitution. This is about redesigning and diversifying that cropping system. Just to make that connection to this analytical framework a little clearer for you. With the grain systems, here our kind of entry point is increasing non-crop diversity. So cover crops are key here. And we'll explain a number of the different services those provide. And what's also important, I think, at least when I reflect and think about this work, is how that encourages crop diversity. And so this really speaks to the need to move away from corn and soybean rotations. Those are going to be really challenging if you have low crop diversity to actually use a system like this. And also just the importance of trying to seek out these synergies between using multiple agroecological practices. And then for the fruit and vegetable systems, farm size I would argue, needs to be considered more when we think about some of our work on these systems. Also, when we're thinking about policy, there are some really important differences among these different farm sizes and how they use these practices, and we could better support farms across the range of scales here. I think there's also an important role farmers can play for increasing practice adoption. Again, since I'm going to try to tie this back at least a little bit to that social movement component of agroecology, and then also make an appeal to interdisciplinary research to address these structural barriers. All right, so for the first section, winter cereals as forage in double cropping systems. Just to orient you to this work again, here we're really focusing on cover crops and crop rotation. So just two of those practices. And we focus in the Northeast, Maryland, and New York in these systems for dairy farmers. So when we were designing this work, the context here that's important is we're really thinking a lot about climate. And so what this figure is showing you is that the change in these very heavy rainfall events, these heavy precipitation events, we're seeing a big increase in the Northeast, more so than in other regions throughout the US. And it's even predicted to continue that trend throughout the rest of the century here. So we're really thinking a lot about this extra water in these systems and how we might manage them. Working with dairy farmers and thinking about their particular cropping system constraints or challenges they might have, there's been some survey work and some work directly through extension educators with a lot of farmers in the Northeast. And a number of key barriers have come up to using cover crops, and that's fall planting timing. So a number of farmers don't feel like they really have enough time at the end of the season. So in that fall to establish a winter cereal cover crop after they harvest, for instance, corn silage or something that's a fairly long season crop. Also, they have a constraint in the spring. They feel like it might delay the planting of whatever that crop might be. So that's a bit of a constraint that farmers have been hesitant to use cover crops. And then, of course, costs, labor, time, seed costs, other inputs are a barrier to using this. So one way that some researchers also here at Cornell, but certainly elsewhere, have tried to encourage the use of these winter cereals over the fall and winter is by using them as a double crop. So yes, we're still establishing them in the fall, but the benefits perhaps for some farmers are a little more tangible. They're actually going to harvest this to feed their animals. So this is where you're going to get an increase of on-farm forage production, which is important. They can also focus on really high quality forage, which is key for feeding different animal groups, which I'll explain briefly. And then you're still getting a lot of the same benefits. You're protecting the soil from erosion. You might get some off-cycle opportunities to apply manure. You're still going to take up some of that residual N at the end of the year. So you still get a lot of those benefits, those environmental benefits that we're normally encouraging farmers to use cover crops for. Okay, so the objective of this work really was to assess the trade-offs between yield, nutritive value, and harvest window across multiple winter cereal species and cultivars. So it's just a brief overview of the methods. As I noted, the field sites are in New York and Maryland. We used a randomized complete block design, 3 different species, so barley, cereal rye, and triticale, and then we had 4 cultivars of each of those species, and then 8 sampling dates throughout the season. We collected data on growth stage, dry matter yield, and then a suite of different forage nutrient value indicators. So acid detergent fiber, neutral detergent fiber, crude protein, and then 48-hour neutral detergent fiber digestibility. Statistical analyses, we use linear and nonlinear mixed effects models, and then some custom contrast and other post-hoc comparison methods. So what you're looking at here is some yield data, yield on the y-axis, growth stage on the Zadig scale along the x-axis. And what's kind of a key takeaway here, I think, is that when you look at Zadig's 45, which is the boot stage, so this is a key stage that a lot of dairy farmers are going to look to for trying to harvest winter cereals as forage. They can usually obtain pretty high quality forage at that time. We see a pretty strong separation here of these triticale and cereal rye cultivars from the barley cultivars down here. And if you were to delay, let that yield get a little higher, the separation just grows. So you also see that some of these cultivars perform, this triticale cultivar here and this barley one here. You see a couple performing or outperforming the other cultivars within that species, but really the takeaway is that barley definitely produces substantially, lower yields than cereal rye triticale. And this will be important when we're thinking about trade-offs. So we didn't see differences between cultivars. So here these lines just represent the 3 species. And on the y-axis here is relative forage quality, which is kind of a summative assessment. It takes in those acid detergent fiber, neutral detergent fiber, et cetera. It brings those all together in a single value. So just to kind of understand why this is important, if you're a dairy farmer, you're going to feed forage to different animal groups based on the quality of that forage. So if you're trying to feed a dairy cow within the first 3 months of lactation, you're going to want at least around 140 relative forage quality or above. So you need some really high quality forage for these animals. Whereas if you're feeding heifers or dry cows, you could feed them potentially some lower quality forage. So they don't have the same nutrient demands. So what you notice here is that, again, at that key stage of Zadex 45, all 3 of those species essentially would be good enough to feed kind of your highest nutrient demanding animal groups, at least in terms of cattle here. So that's important, especially if farmers are looking for that high quality on-farm forage production. If we delay a little bit, you start to see a big separation here. Barley still maintains really high forage quality, whereas triticale and cereal rye decline in quality much more rapidly. And so this is important when we think about harvest windows and timing. So there's real obvious trade-offs here, right? So when we look at these harvest windows, you're looking at kind of just your typical S-shaped logistic relationship here for these phenological models. Ordinal day along the x-axis, that just counts up from January 1st, and then you have growth stage on the y-axis. And I've added a line here for that key boot stage. And so what you're really seeing is that cereal rye reaches that key boot stage around 4 days earlier than barley, 6 days, almost a week earlier than triticale, and barley reaches that stage 2.5 days or so earlier than triticale. This may not seem like a lot. This is a really busy time of year for dairy farmers. And so the difference of a handful of days can really be important when they have a lot of field work to take care of, weather's unpredictable. And when you see such, fairly dramatic drop-offs in terms of quality, you want to have a little bit of flexibility to be able to capture a high-quality forage if the whole point of you producing that forage on farm is to feed, those animal groups that have high nutrient demands. So when you think back to all this, these results I shared, all these data, it really is about a lot of trade-offs. So yield, cereal rye, triticale produce the greatest yield. Barley, in terms of nutritive value, it declined most slowly. That's an advantage. Maturity, cereal rye was earliest to that boot stage, which is obviously good if the farmer wants to establish that subsequent crop, right? This is a double cropping system. They can get that in the ground earlier if they can pull off that winter cereal earlier, right? That harvest window ends up being longest with barley. If any of you noticed, it actually had the steepest, exponential growth phase, or that log phase of growth with those phenological models. But that's somewhat negated by the fact that it just maintains such high quality across time that it still has the longest harvest window, which is definitely a major advantage, but it has pretty low yield, at least in the Northeast. And which I didn't talk about, what is certainly important is cold tolerance or winter hardiness. Barley has the lowest cold tolerance. We even had issues with it around Tompkins County here. If you were to go further north, you might run into similar challenges. And of course, this is where breeding could come in and help out perhaps to some degree. I think when you look at this collectively, one thing I'd perhaps point out is that triticale, although it doesn't perform the best in as many of these different metrics or values, it's a really consistent intermediate performer. And perhaps in that sense, it might be pretty flexible and advantageous for a dairy farmer to use. And there has been work around here on different types of summer annual crops that would follow winter cereal. And I think that's really important here when we're thinking about this, agroecosystem redesign. So shorter summer annual forage crops are important. So like forage sorghum, would be a really key and important crop that's a lot shorter season than, say, corn silage. And so this type of work, whole system work, is going to be important for moving these systems towards kind of a more redesign phase. All right, so shifting to the second kind of major component of my work, these cover crop-based no-till planted soybean systems. We're going to now look at 4 practices: compost, reduced tillage, cover cropping, and crop rotation. We're going to stay in the Northeast, in Maryland and New York, but now we're, like I said, with these grain systems. So again, with this work, we are really thinking about the context, or the climate and its impact on the soil in the Northeast with these extreme precipitation events. So of course, you've got increased soil erosion, which you can see here in early summer in the soybean field. You're going to have more runoff. This is going to cause a lot of adverse impacts on aquatic ecosystems in particular, eutrophication, loading of sediment, synthetics, and nutrients. This could delay planting for farmers. Also, if it's really wet in the spring and you have all that soil exposed, and then fewer days in the fields that are workable. In contrast, we have these cover crop-based systems, which a photo taken at a similar time helps address a lot of these challenges, at least in terms of the erosive impacts of precipitation. We have this thick cover crop mulch that protects the soil. It also provides organic matter and a host of other ecosystem services, which I'll touch upon a little bit, in particular, weed suppression. So not everyone in this room is going to be familiar with this system, so I'll do a quick overview of it to give you a sense, kind of start to finish, of what this looks like. So in the fall, you want to apply a little bit of compost. We're expecting a lot of different services from this cover crop, so it's not an afterthought. It's not something you just seed at the end of the season quickly. We need it to perform well, so you're adding some compost in there, getting that seed planted earlier in the fall if possible. It's going to emerge dormant throughout the winter. When it resumes growth in the spring, we're then hoping that it's going to put on a lot of biomass. In particular, literature has shown that we should be aiming for around 8 megagrams per hectare of cover crop biomass, which is a lot of plant material. And this is important a little bit later here. I'll point out. I'll explain why. Once those cover crops have reached anthesis, so you can see the anthers there, it's a good indication that they're at maturity that will result in good termination. And so that looks like this. You're taking a roller crimper through the field. It's bending those crops over at their base. It crushes that vascular system and they slowly die, leaving a thick weed suppressive mulch in the field. You can no-till plant right through that mulch. And in fact, you didn't see it in that short video on the tractor, but you can have a no-till planter on the back of that tractor and complete this in a single pass. Perhaps surprisingly, these soybeans actually emerge through all this biomass. They're large-seeded crops, have good energy stores. They do make it out through that mulch. A little bit later in the summer, if you've managed it well, you should hopefully see these nice, fairly weed-free, inter-row spaces. A lot of cover crop biomass persists long throughout the season. This image is also important for some of the results I'll show in a moment. Here we're looking at some shading right underneath the canopy. These are 30-inch rows, but we're interested in seeing those that canopy closure in terms of weed suppression. You want those soybeans to shade out weeds. And so I'll speak more about that in a moment. And then of course, in the fall, it's time for harvest. Another important aspect of this system in terms of context is related to weed emergence or weed periodicity. Looking at some research here, this is a violin plot that shows where the majority of these different species are emerging. This is in PA, but certainly relevant here for New York. And in general, we're talking about the Northeast. And you can see that common ragweed or Ambrosia artemisifolia is emerging earlier than some of these other species. This species can also survive rolling crimping. And so it can be really problematic in these cover crop-based systems in the Northeast. So we wanted to think about ways that we might tackle this problematic species. In terms of the objective of this work, we wanted to terminate these cover crops before, during, and after anthesis. So again, thinking about that problematic weed, can we shift rolling time to maybe manage it a little bit better? And then we wanted to look at the effects of that on cover crop biomass, weed biomass, soybean yield, and cover crop reseeding. So in terms of the experimental design, again, field sites in New York and Maryland. This was a split block design this time. We had those same 3 species, 4 cultivars of each. And here we have 4 roll plant dates that span generally kind of early May all the way into June, about a week apart. This is obviously shifted a little earlier, further south in Maryland. And I'll just briefly point out, these photos were taken on the same day in late July. Maybe a little hard to see, but there's a lot of winter cereals standing up here in between the rows, especially in the early phase. So those winter cereals haven't reached anthesis when we rolled, so they didn't terminate as well. And this is where this reseeding aspect comes in. I won't really spend time today talking about that, but it's just to say there are a number of different components with this system that are important to take into consideration when we're trying to optimize it and find different ways to manage, weeds in this instance. Of course, later planting results in some yield declines. As you can see, these soybeans haven't grown nearly as much by late July. We collected a wide range of biophysical data, and then our statistical analyses were linear, mixed effects models, and then some structural equation modeling, or in particular, a mediation analysis. So I'm not going to use a lot of kind of the jargon associated with structural equation modeling, exogenous and endogenous variables. We'll talk about this simply. We have 4 factors here: cover crop biomass, soybean density, weed biomass, and soybean yield. And asterisks indicate statistical significance here. The thickness of those arrows indicate the strength of that relationship. And I'll explain a little bit what those mean. So first, what this is indicating is that if you increase cover crop biomass, you're going to get a significant reduction in weed biomass, right? So this makes sense. If you have more biomass, perhaps there's some interspecific competition as those cover crops are still growing, but then also when you roll it down, it's going to have that thicker weed suppressive mulch, which is going to have a suppressive effect on weeds. However, if you produce too much biomass, lodging can be a problem. So those winter cereal species can fall over. Those plants can fall over. And that's a problem because it's really hard to roll down cover crops that are already toppled over in all sorts of different directions. When you try to go through with a no-till planter, you need those crops to really be parallel to the direction that you're planting that soybean. And so what ends up happening is you get really poor seed-to-soil contact. You can see large gaps here in the rows. You can even see actually a little bit of yellowing in these soybeans because there was so much biomass competing for scarce resources in the soil. And so we can see this effect in the path analysis here. We see that cover crop biomass, if you increase it, it has a negative effect, or it reduces soybean density. And so why does that matter? Well, as I pointed out before, soybean density, it can hasten canopy closure. So we use, this is a very old kind of cultural weed management tactic that farmers have used for a long time. If you increase crop density, you can increase canopy closure, or you can make that occur earlier in the season. And so this is what we do in this system. We use high soybean planting rates to try to achieve earlier canopy closure to help suppress weeds through that shading effect. And we're seeing that here in the results of the path analysis. Certainly, weed biomass is going to have a negative effect on crop yield, in this case, soybean yield. So this is all to say that it's all of these factors that are important, and that we don't really want to be just trying to maximize one component of this system. We're trying to look for optimization here. And so perhaps there should be a reconsideration of this 8 megagram per hectare biomass threshold. And that multi-tactic approach to weed management is definitely important here. We're using mechanical, physical, and cultural approaches. It's kind of a many little hammers or ecological weed management approach. And then crop diversification enhances the adaptability of this. So as I noted before, this is going to be a hard system in terms of timing if you're working with very few main grain cash crops. If you only have corn and soy, this is going to be hard to make this work. Even corn, soybean, wheat, which is a little more common in the Northeast, I think some farmers still find that that can be a little difficult. And so if you have a broader diversity of crops that you're working with, there's just a lot more chance that you're going to have success with a system like this. And this is how this is connected again to the agroecosystem redesign. So for the final section, here we're looking at fruit and vegetable systems. So this is going to focus on all 8 of these different practices. This is national in scale this time, as opposed to the Northeast. Okay, so a little bit of context. When we were starting with this work, we were interested in farm size trends over time. So what this figure is showing you, the y-axis here is proportion of total US cropland, and then you have year along the x-axis here. And over the past 30 years, what you're looking at is some pretty significant changes. So larger farms, so farms that are at least 405 hectares in size, in cropland hectares, increase the proportion of land that they're managing in the US by about 24%. And we saw almost a similar reduction for this kind of intermediate sized farms. So farms that are 40 to 404 hectares. Smaller scale farms, so farms that are 39 hectares or smaller, saw very little change over these last 3 decades. We are curious though, does this trend hold for organic farms? And I'm actually not sure I mentioned this up front. All of this work has been in organically managed systems, but a lot of these different practices are of course applicable to all forms of farm management. But I was reminded of this as I'm looking at the title of this slide here. So does this trend hold for organic farms? The data on this from the USDA is a little cumbersome to talk through, so it's easier to just explain it this way. It's basically a small number of large-scale farmers who are predominantly conventional, but they have a small amount of their land, at least relative to the conventional acreage, under organic management. And they operate the majority of organic cropland in the US. So this kind of phenomenon has been termed conventionalization in the literature. And there are a number of characteristics that have been associated with this idea of conventionalizing organic agriculture. So larger farm size, simplified agroecosystems, a standardization of production, and here we're thinking managerially as well as biologically, greater mechanization on these farms, a reliance on input substitution. So that's that level 2 when we're thinking of that framework. So often farmers who are used to maybe more conventional management are simply looking for, organically approved inputs to replace their synthetic inputs that they're familiar with. So that's that input substitution. These farms tend to focus on wholesale, which makes sense because they're larger farms, so they're export-oriented as well, typically. And there's been a concern about a dilution of organic standards or a weakening of those standards. And coming out of this work is this idea that there's a bifurcation among organic farmers, that you essentially have small scale, more artisanal producers, so very little conventionalization. These are highly diverse agroecosystems and that are kind of focused on direct sales. So we're thinking of CSA farmers, farmers market farmers, relying on farm gate sales, that kind of system. And then you have your larger scale farms, which I was just describing, highly conventionalized, much simpler agroecosystems and export oriented. Just want to say, of course, there's a range, there's a spectrum. It's sometimes not that helpful to think about the world in binaries. Certainly have come across farms that are very large and very diverse, surprisingly so. And those are real models, I think, for some of the larger scale farms. And similarly, you can find small farms that necessarily aren't exemplary of all the things you might associate with agroecological diversified management. So with all this in mind, when we think back to this framework, our group was really thinking, well, how does farm size perhaps relate to this idea of incremental or transformational change in agriculture? And is there any relationship here between farm size and efficiency, substitution, and redesign practices? So we came up with this conceptual framework here. The y-axis is practice use probability, so 1 being highly likely that you will use this practice, 0 being not likely to use a practice. And the x-axis here is farm size. And so through this kind of conceptual framework, we're thinking that larger organic farms are more likely to use efficiency practices, that there may not be a size relationship for substitution practices based on farm size. And then that smaller organic farms are more likely to use those redesign practices. Okay. So the objectives of this work were really to assess the effect of farm size on these 8 different agroecological practices among organic fruit and vegetable growers, and then analyze motivations and deterrents to their use. So in terms of methods, took a couple different approaches here. Our survey was national. Most states are represented here. I conducted 50 semi-structured in-depth interviews in California and New York. And so those farmers ranged from less than half a hectare all the way up to over 40,000 hectares. That's an enormous fruit and vegetable farm. Data collection, so we have quantitative data through that electronic questionnaire. So this is through Qualtrics. Qualitative data through all those interviews, all those recorded interviews. And then data analysis, I tried to take a mixed methods approach here. So we use quantitative approaches like generalized linear models. So I'll show you some work on the binomial logistic regression. We use multivariate techniques. I won't get into that here. And then certainly qualitative coding for all that interview-based data. So some results. On the y-axis, you're looking at the total number of practices used. These are violin plots again. The width indicates the number of respondents that indicated their total number of practices used here. And so you see those 3 main farm sizes also along the x-axis. So the takeaway, larger farms use the fewest number of agroecological practices, which is perhaps not surprising. Although overall, I think you'll note that practice use is pretty high. And that's what we see across these 8 practices when we break it out practice by practice. If you were to spend some time and look at this, what you're really seeing is perhaps an effect of a little bit of organic certification requirements, but you see fairly high use of a number of these different practices. But I'll draw your attention to 3 for this talk here that we do see some big differences. So small scale farms were at least 1.4, even upwards of 2.5 times more likely to use intercropping and secondary planting and border plantings than their larger scale organic counterparts. So if we kind of just focus on insectary plantings for a moment, here's a field of Brussels sprouts on a 200 hectare organic farm in California. So this is kind of that intermediate size farm. So not a small farm. These practices do exist on larger farms. And so what you see here is strip intercropping with cilantro. And so this farmers let the cilantro go to flower, and that's going to attract some beneficial insects to help with biological pest control. So in particular, this farmer is interested in hoverflies or syrphid flies, or more specifically, their larvae, to help take care of aphids and other pests of brassicas. So it's one thing to see these practices used on farms that are around 200, 300 hectares, or certainly are very small, highly diversified farms. But how do we get it? How do we see these farms on larger farms? Like this photo I took out here in California, again, that's much larger than 405 hectares. I think if you look at the literature on this, especially if you look at some of the meta-analyses and reviews and syntheses, there's a very few consistent results in terms of the determinants of practice adoption, especially when you focus on individual level factors. So I mean kind of socio-psychological factors here, so attitudes, values, behaviors. A lot of work tries to understand why farmers are adopting practices based on those types of factors. And so what I think is important is that we think a little bit more broadly. These different individual behaviors don't exist in a vacuum. Context is important, and there are structural barriers. And so I'll give you 2 examples from some of my interview-based work, pulling some kind of representative quotes from farmers. first on food safety and then on labor policy. So here, I'm just going to read you this quote from a farmer out in California. You have to make sure you're checking your traps every day and there's no animal intrusion. I mean, the sad part about it is fires want you to kill every living wildlife around. Frogs, if you see any open water, you try to clear it up or you put copper sulfate in the ponds to neutralize them. If the frogs come out and they get your spinach, that's it. Buyers will say, you know what, we're not going to work with this ranch anymore because of this issue. So what I think is important in a quote like this is this farmer is noting it's really sad that he has to manage all wildlife with such lethal tactics. And I think it's also important to note, so this isn't really reflective of perhaps his environmental values. You know, this isn't how he thinks about environmental stewardship on a personal level. There are some structural forces here that are kind of moving his hand towards these management decisions. And what's also, I think, useful to note is this is not a government policy. This isn't the Food Safety Modernization Act. This is from the private sector. These are buyers or large-scale retailers that are imposing these types of restrictions on how this farmer is managing their fields. So that is a pretty challenging issue for, I guess, us as researchers also to engage with when it's private as opposed to public. So as one more example here, we'll look at labor policy. So I'll just read the quote again. Labor is an issue for everybody. It's an issue for me because the increasing costs, this rising minimum wage is a burden on all small businesses like myself. The price of corn, the price of cucumbers has not risen appreciably in the last 5 years. My labor bill is up 40%. Not only does the wage go up, all the supporting costs to have employees go up too. So here he's thinking about healthcare or unemployment benefits. This is something that I've heard again and again with farmers. Very concerned about changes in the minimum wage as well as overtime pay. Farmers were very sympathetic and often loudly supportive of a living wage. This isn't a small issue. They wanted to take care of their farm workers. You often had farmers talk about their farm workers as if they're part of the family. They're also squeezed here. They have very thin margins. I think a reading of USDA data on farmer profitability is kind of a grim reading. And so there are not a lot of options here. And I think sometimes when we think about these issues, there are policies outside of the farmer's control, obviously, that are having a really significant impact on how they may manage their farms. And so we were able to ask farmers about this in our survey. So here I'll bring back a little bit of my survey data. On the y-axis, you're looking at proportion of farmers in terms of the respondents. Again, the same 3 farm size categories. And we asked them, how are you going to manage this increasing minimum wage? And that differs state by state, of course. California, New York, it's definitely increasing more rapidly than in other states. What I want to just draw your attention to is that more mechanization was an important way that some farmers were going to manage this increasing minimum wage, particularly as farm size increases. So these larger farms are already the most mechanized. If you recall, mechanization is also largely associated with this idea of conventionalization, getting larger and larger. And so this is, I think, an important finding in terms of how we think about these changes in the organic sector. These farmers are looking to remove farm workers because of that economic burden. So as one farmer noted, we've got more mechanization on the harvesting side that we're focused on. We have an R&D division that's trying to mechanize as many aspects of harvesting as we can. I asked, and what would you say is driving this shift in focus? And they responded, it's all driven by the minimum wage hike. So what I think's interesting about some of these results is that when we talk about agroecological practices, we often think of them as knowledge intensive and labor intensive. So we wanted to explore this a little bit. We asked farmers in the survey who had used these different practices, well, what is the labor requirement? How are you experiencing this? So it's a Likert scale here from very low to very high. We got some responses, but we also asked farmers who have never used those practices at all, well, what do you perceive the labor requirement to be for using these different agroecological practices? What would you expect them to, how labor intensive would you expect them to be? And what perhaps is interesting, when you just focus on the high and very high labor requirements, you see that across the board, farmers who have never used those practices are perceiving them to be more labor intensive than farmers who do use those practices are reporting them to be. And this is where I think we can look to some of the research and just on the ground experience of social movements. This is where farmer to farmer or peer-to-peer sharing of knowledge is really important. So this is horizontal knowledge transfer. This is a key component of social movements when we're thinking about agroecology. And so this is one small way that for me, I see there being opportunities for kind of this social networking approach, and maybe a different way to try to transfer knowledge than perhaps we sometimes do if we want to see greater adoption of these types of practices across farms. So in summary for this section, as we saw, large-scale organic farmers are less likely to use just some, not all, but of these agroecological practices. Barriers to practices are always contextual. They can also be biophysical barriers, which we didn't talk about today, but certainly that's an important factor, and they're often structural, right? Big picture things like food safety regulations or labor policy. And I would argue that scientists should engage more with policymakers and certainly with farmers when we're trying to address some of these challenges that farmers are facing in using things like agroecological practices. As kind of an overall summary for my work, let's bring it back to this analytical framework here. Again, we were really trying to focus on level 3 here, right at that threshold between incremental and transformational changes in agriculture. And I think I'll just note that transformative changes are nonlinear. So when we think back to all those resources being spent on levels 1 and 2 to increase efficiency or substitution practices, empirical evidence doesn't show that just because you've moved from level 1 to 2, that you'll then continue on towards a redesign and then changing a local or global food system or anything like that. So we need to be thinking carefully about where we're putting our resources and our time towards the type of changes that we're interested in seeing. And so this is where setting ambitious interdisciplinary goals, I think, are key. And we want to make sure we're aligning our research with the urgency and the magnitude of the socio-ecological crises that we're facing. So again, this is just bringing us back to those calls for transformative change as opposed to perhaps smaller, more conservative improvements in the dominant agricultural systems that we have. So with that, I want to acknowledge, there's a lot of people to acknowledge here, but certainly I'll begin with my committee, Matt Ryan, Rachel Besner-Kerr, and Sunny Power. Project teams, I won't read everyone out, but the forage team was large, included people in animal science as well as the soil and crop sciences department, a lot of different extension educators and farmers. The grading team, both here and at the USDA in Maryland. Our vegetable group includes folks from University of California, Berkeley, University of British Columbia, the Nature Conservancy, and here at Cornell. I couldn't have done any of this work without farmer interviewees, the pilot study participants that really helped us refine our tools in terms of both our survey and our interviews, and all the survey respondents that took time out to fill out a very long survey. I didn't mention how long that survey was. It was very long. I definitely want to make a special note to the Food Agroecology Justice and Wellbeing Collective. I am deeply appreciative of all the conversations we had with that group of graduate students and postdocs over the years. Those discussions have definitely informed my thinking about food systems. And so I'm deeply appreciative of all of those, really intellectually enriching conversations. Ryan, Besner-Kerr, and Di Tommaso labs, and that's everyone from our lab managers to undergraduate research assistants, and certainly all graduate student colleagues. Folks at CSCU, in particular, Erica, Stephen, and Lynn, were incredibly helpful as I worked through a lot of different statistical approaches during my time here. And I would like to acknowledge the Atkins Center and the Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council of Canada for their financial support with this work. And with that, I don't know where we're at with time, but be happy to take questions.
We do have a bit of time for questions, 5 minutes or so.
Great.
I have a fairly simple question. I was really intrigued by the triticale and barley fall planting and then spring harvesting. If I understand the system, it might go in after silage harvest as a form of like a no-till planting, drilling for us. But then on the other side, I wasn't exactly clear. I think you said 130 Julian days of days which would be about mid or late April is when you would get the boot stage when you might harvest. Is that, am I on the right track there?
Yeah.
And I was going to ask you, how are those forages harvested and fed to the animals?
Okay, so great questions. So yeah, I think, well, for at least when we were harvesting those in New York, for instance, I think the boot stage was often arriving around early May. So not typically in April, but yeah, right around that time. And that's where it's important, those noting earlier, the better, so you can get that subsequent crop in. In terms of how these are being fed to animals, I don't think they're typically being ensiled. So I think this is kind of like fresh chalk being fed. I would say I'm not a dairy expert on the side of things here. I skew more towards the field management there, but I don't think these farmers are, say, ensiling it for a long time before that. But
yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So then if it's harvested in the first part of May, then there's a good chance you could go back and plant another crop for that season.
Well, right. So that's, and maybe I didn't make that clear enough. So that would be the double cropping system, right? So the key part of that is getting 2 harvests within that same calendar year. So you're getting that first harvest there, let's say early May of that winter cereal, maybe at boot stage, maybe a little bit later, you're feeding that to your animals. Then you're planting something like corn silage or maybe that forage sorghum, and then harvesting that same year, just obviously maybe in August or September. Yeah. Yeah. Anyone else? Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks for the talk. It was so great. Really good to hear everything you've been up to. But I wanted to ask, what do you think was the most important method for really getting at the structural barriers?
That's a good question. It's a tough one to answer. I guess I would say, well, maybe the easiest answer is an interdisciplinary method. I find, at least for myself, I find it interesting to engage with a couple different methodologies. So it was nice to bring in, let's say, be able to exercise some skills I've gained, doing some quantitative analyses, but then have this really rich, granular interview-based data. So these qualitative data that I might code and think really carefully about and relate to a lot of different social science theory and try to bring those together. That for me, I think is an important way to really get at some of those structural barriers. I think it can be really hard to do that just through survey work, for instance, in particular. If you only wanted to go with one, I think being able to have conversations with farmers, you're more likely to get at some of those, but survey work's deceptively difficult to do. Some people, I'm sure, can maybe get at it with carefully worded questions. Yeah.
Did you do the qualitative interview work before the survey or at the same time?
Kind of the same time. We did I did some pilot, I did a number of different pilot studies, but I did do some interview work first. So things like food safety, for instance, not being in California, and having spent a number of years previous kind of with my head in the grain systems, I wasn't necessarily thinking about food safety, but then doing some interviews, that was very clear. I needed to be talking about food safety regulations. We're talking about fruit and vegetables, and that was really coming up as influencing practice use. And so, for instance, that informed some questions on the survey. So I do think doing some focus groups, whether that's a small group of farmers or a handful of individual interviews, is really important for informing a survey tool. Yeah.
Hey, Jeff, I was wondering, where does kind of consumer cost come into this? And I'm thinking here, we're always trying to have the lowest price for our consumers. Obviously, that makes a lot of sense. And you're hearing these growers saying, we're going to, mechanize, so we're going to have fewer folks there. A lot of that money is not getting to the farmers. I mean, it's pretty clear that it's the middle person. How does that kind of impact, or did you hear from, hey, if we only got more money, from the actual, consumer, that we would be in better shape to, incorporate some of these tactics, and we just can't.
Right. I mean, that's honestly one of the major issues that we kept coming back to in interviews that I don't necessarily have an answer for. These farmers, which, yeah, I probably didn't make clear enough in the presentation, but yeah, it's these increases in, say, labor costs. Labor is often the largest input costs on a farm. The farmer's absorbing that. It's not the wholesale buyers or processors, and it's not the supermarket retailers. Typically, they're trying to keep those prices low.
Right.
And I had some, I mean, I just didn't have time. I had some other quotes that are, I think, use a lot stronger language about how they've been treated by some of these large scale buyers. They have very little negotiating power sometimes. And, you know, yes, if we increase the price of food, would that help if the farmer was able to get some of that back? I think that's where direct marketing can help when farmers are working directly with consumers. But then, of course, you have millions of Americans that are food insecure right now. So even at the very cheap prices, and cheap in quotations here, of course, there's lots of externalized costs. But that one is, and this is, I guess, the types of questions that I find interesting because they are so complicated and bring in so many different dimensions here. But I don't have any simple answer for you, but it did come up again and again. Yeah.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.